Podcasting is more than just talking, it's listening. BSing with Bob Schmidt.
The BS with Bob Schmidt podcast featuring entrepreneurs, business people, and marketers. Talking this week with the author of The Perfect Mix, Helen Rothberg, joining me. She's into leadership, strategic planning, and she's the author, as I mentioned, of The Perfect Mix. I had the opportunity to have Helen on my radio program a few months ago and really enjoyed chatting with her and thought I'd bring her back to talk a little bit more about this book and about strategic planning. Helen, thanks for being on the show with me. I appreciate it.
Hey, thank you. It's my pleasure.
The book is called The Perfect Mix, and it's basically everything I know about leadership I learned as a bartender. And being an upper Midwest guy, being a Wisconsin guy, we spend a lot of time in the bars, as I'm assuming that a lot of people all over the country do. How so? How do you mean that the things you learned about leadership you learned as a bartender?
Well, working behind the bars is a microcosm of living in a business and working in a community. And I learned about managing difficult people. I learned a lot of lessons about how to communicate, how to read body language. I learned how to multitask. I learned how to manage a staff of people who were very eccentric and interesting and capable and moody, and just all the things that you would run into when you're at work happened right there behind the bar.
Is being a bartender something that drove you to become a doctor, or was that already a plan?
Well, that's a really interesting question. So originally, the kind of doctor I was going to be was a medical doctor because I have, a Jewish mother, and that was the only option you were given. And bartending was my methodology, if you will, or my way to pay for graduate school. Waitressing paid for college because we were people who had a lot of heart and a lot of love, but not a lot of means. And as I was in college, I realized and worked in hospitals, I didn't want to do that. And I found what I wound up studying by mistake. And then it was a beautiful, coincidental, supportive relationship to be studying business and management and strategy and behavioral science, because I did all of that, and to then be working in a place where I could try out everything that I was learning. And, I wound up earning a dual PhD, if you will, in behavioral science and strategy. And so I did become that doctor, but as my mother would say, but not the kind that can help anybody.
Not the real kind.
So not the real kind, yeah. So, you can never win, so you might as well know how to pour a drink no matter what.
I got a buddy that's a doctor in education, and his mother introduces him the same way. This is my son, but he's not a real doctor.
Right, not a real doctor. If you can't write, if you can't use that script pad, nobody wants to bother you, which is a good thing too.
So did that open up your skill set then as a bartender? So you're able to listen and you're able to, self-observe and to find out the different problems that people may have and help them to come up with a solution?
Absolutely. It was like a living laboratory. Because if you do bartending correctly, of which only 1/4 of the skill is pouring drinks, the rest is really being able to make people feel comfortable and feel at home. It's about being able to get people to talk to each other at the bar so you're not working that hard. And it's about being trusted to keep your mouth shut when people tell you things that are important and intimate to themselves. But yeah, I got to work with a lot of different people who had a lot of different challenges. And sometimes, I did give advice because bartenders give good advice. And a lot of them later on, they first assumed, of course, because it was New York City, that I was an actor or a dancer, because that's what all actors and dancers are, bartenders and waitresses. But once they found out I was in business school, the discussions became a little bit more on point. And it was really a great way for me to talk with people about some of the things I was learning and what really worked and what really didn't work. And I also learned something really important that I didn't learn as much as a waitress, and that is to read body language. Because people will be telling you something or not telling you something. Sometimes what people don't say is the biggest communicator. And if you watch their face and if you listen to the tone of voice and you see how their body is moving or what their hands are doing, you really can understand more the inside of what they're feeling. And if you could do that, then you can be more helpful in the kinds of recommendations that you might make or even in how to react to them that very specific day. So it was a magnificent laboratory to really hone my skill.
Helen, that sounds a lot like being a conversationalist because when you're talking with somebody, if you look them in the eye and if you give them their space to kind of be themselves, they do tell you way more of the story with their body language and with the, the twirl of the hair or the, the look up or the look down or the shift or the, you can find out a lot of things just by watching and observing.
Yeah, that's really where the real communication takes place, I believe. So, a lot of this gets challenged in our world today where so much of what we do is digital and not face to face. But in those important moments, nothing, I think, overcomes being able to look somebody in the eye.
Oh, I totally agree. As an instructor, do you teach your students these types of things?
Oh, I try to teach it and I try to model it. And one thing you learn when you've been teaching as long as I have, students have become a bit more reserved. I think, being out in the open and speaking their mind is something on a certain level they're not as comfortable with as they are, let's say, texting what they want to say. And I have learned just watching a classroom when people aren't asking questions, or if only one person asks a question, or just by the height of the shoulders to the ear, whether or not they're understanding, whether or not I need to try a new example, whether or not there's a different method, whether I need to move around the room, whether I need to make them stand up and stretch. It really does, reading the room as a speaker, as a consultant, as a trainer, and all the things that I do. Reading the room is even more important, if you will, than the lesson, quote unquote, the lesson plan. Sometimes when I work with clients and I give them a proposal or tell them how I'm going to run, a full day, let's say, visioning session or leadership session, I don't give them a lot of specifics because I know what I need to do. How I'm going to do it and what it's going to look like depends on what the room tells me.
Huh.
So, yeah, being a bartender really taught me more than I ever understood until much later in life.
So it's a lot about reading the room or reading the people that you're around.
Absolutely.
The funny thing is that you mentioned, about the student and the talking. I was a non-traditional student. I just graduated with an associate's degree in sales management.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I aced every class. I got one B, one AB, and all the rest A's. Mm-hmm. So I was pretty proud of myself. But being a non-traditional student, it was weird because I was the oldest man in the class. I was older than a lot of my instructors, but I asked a lot of questions. And in turn, because of that, I think that I garnered respect from the younger students that didn't know how to ask a question.
Absolutely. And I would invite you to sit in every one of my classes if you'd like, because that's what I see. The more mature students are able to do that. The younger ones, they're so afraid of stepping in the wrong place. Social media is so unforgiving. You write one bad tweet, you post one bad picture on Facebook, and it follows you. So I really think it's made some students very skittish. And I feel my job is to make sure they don't wind up in a cubicle somewhere. I want them in an office with a window with natural light. Mm-hmm. And to do that, they've got to have a voice. They've got to have the courage and the confidence to question. And I have to teach them even how to question and speak. Like in my room, the words like, and I mean are never allowed in a sentence. I want them to have confidence and be authentic and speak what they mean. And it's hard for them. So you know what? I'm glad they had you as their experience because I bet you elevated the experience in that class.
Well, I
and I would make you restate that, Bob.
So do you think that that's really a teachable moment? Do you think that you can teach a student or teach a millennial, if you will, the proper way to ask a question, the way to stand up and to be proud of who they are? Yes,
I do believe that. But I believe it takes multiple forms and sources and resources. So one of the things I do, and the course I teach primarily is strategy, and strategy is the capstone course for a business degree, whether it's an undergraduate degree or an MBA. And it pulls together everything else you've learned across your business curriculum and then elevates it to a certain point. So it's really intense, it's heady. And I start every Monday, so once a week, I read them a poem because I believe there's a lot in what you do that's both art and science. And you need both sides of your brains, your right brain and your left brain, working together. And I read them poems about courage, and I read them poems about reaching high, and I read them poems about managing difficult situations. And some of the poets are American poets like Mary Oliver, or they might be a Sufi master such as like Rumi. So yeah, I believe you can. And you got to take them out of their comfort zone, because that's what education is supposed to be. Companies will always pretty much teach you what they want you to know.
Right.
We're supposed to get you ready with a skill set and a value base to be able to go out there and face the world. And yeah, I think you can help people find themselves.
So Helen, with strategy, is that similar to game theory? Are you teaching students to think about the big picture and how to perhaps make, if I do this jump and this jump, then this may happen?
That's a beautiful way of expressing it. Yes, strategy is really about understanding a few things, that you don't live in a vacuum, and any move a company is going to make is going to be counter-moved by competitors, some who you know, some who are, lurking in the distance. I don't think the advertising industry ever thought that their biggest competitor was going to be Google. And it teaches them also to make really informed choices. So strategy is like rolling the dice, but doing it with information or playing cards. It's gambling like anything else. Companies, none of us have crystal balls. So it's how do you learn as much as you can about all the different kinds of things that could impact what it is you want to do. And knowing where your competitors are strong and weak, knowing where you're strong and weak, how could you make the best guess about investing a company's resources for the future? So it really takes a lot of thinking, integrating, guts, moxie. It's art and science.
As a father, I oftentimes told my kids not to think about the next step or the second step, but to think 5 steps ahead. And it's funny because my kids I can see it happening now. I have twins that are 16. They're my youngest, and I have a 20-year-old and I have a 23-year-old. And I can see all of them thinking past the next 2 or 3 steps, which I think that means that I've been a success as a father. But sometimes I wonder if maybe 6 or 7 steps isn't enough, that they should be thinking 10 or 15 steps ahead.
Well, we don't want to overwhelm them. So look at it as if it's a game of chess. You always have to be a few moves ahead, but you also have to live in the now, because as much as you need to try to be planning what's next, we have this little joke that, you plan and God laughs. You still have to be able to see what's going on around you,
right,
so you could be responsive. So I think you're really gearing them in exactly the way they should be geared. Live in the now and look ahead. We also do a little bit more of what you're talking about, that far-reaching planning. I teach that actually in a different venue at the Academy of Competitive Intelligence in Cambridge. It's called scenario analysis. So if what's going on now is operational and strategy is really asking what's next, scenario analysis would say, what if? Like trying to understand what would happen if one of those black swans is something you never believed would happen, what would you do and how would you be ready for it? So, you could do a little of that also.
So is it kind of fictionalizing things?
Well, I would say storytelling, because you're basing it on real factors. You would say, what is most important to the well-being of my company, and what out in the environment is most uncertain? Like, what can I not control but would have a really big impact on how I operate? And what would I then do if that happens?
Well, let's jump into your book here. It's called The Perfect Mix.
Sure.
Everything I know about leadership I learned as a bartender. And when you open it up and kind of page through it, you look at advice. That's something that bartenders give, and you've kind of come up with an acronym for advice.
Yeah, advice. So the A in advice is action, and the message and the lesson there, if you want, is do more and say less. D is determination, and it's about sticking to things and getting things done with civility and ingenuity. V is vision, and it's about knowing where you want to be and where you want to get to, not just yourself, but your teammates, your businesses, your communities, your country. Integrity, tell the truth all the time. Don't create drama. Don't play into drama, but if you do own what's yours, you're human and none of us are perfect, and that's okay. Here we go again, communication. Try to be understood, try to understand, and try to listen better and be present. And then empathy, dare to care because everyone has a story. And then there are two garnishes to that model. One is about being your authentic self, standing in your own shoes and being who you really are. And the final one is about being a shapeshifter, recognizing that change is inevitable and being willing to change.
That would be a hard one, I think. I think a lot of people have difficulty with that last one, I would guess.
It is the hardest because when you've done something and been successful at it for a long time, and this is true for companies as well, it's really hard to look yourself in the mirror and say, this has worked for me for so long, but it's not working anymore because the world is different. I've been an educator for 34 years. And in that time, I've been 5 different professors. I've had to change my style and my approach because, each generation of students is different. They learn differently. They focus on different things. They're concerned about different things.
Well, I found even as a radio personality that's happened too, because I started off as a music DJ. Then I got into talk radio. Then I got let go from a talk radio job. Then I got another job as a news guy. Then I got a radio station changed format so that way it could be a talk radio station. Then it's I got laid off from that. Now I'm just kind of doing my own thing, talking to people and enjoying life to the full. I'm enjoying things now, not making any money, more so than I was making money.
Yeah, that's not unusual, by the way, but you're also doing something really important. So if I could take a minute to say what you've done that people can learn from. So you've taken what you're best at and always found a way to grow a new branch on your tree from what you're best at. You have these really strong roots and you know what they are. You're a great conversationalist. You keep people interested. You have a beautiful voice. And so if people can really focus in on what they're good at, they're always going to be able, and that's about being authentic. They're going to be able to change with the world. They'll find a new way to use what they're good at.
Well, Helen, just from what you said there, you gotten a big tip from me if you were my bartender.
Absolutely. And as a radio personality, you're a great educator.
Oh,
don't forget that. You are in a good spot there.
That's how, it's funny because a lot of times you don't realize the things that you're good at or that you have as a bonus until somebody actually points it out and says, hey, by the way. And then you stop and you think and you look and you're like, you're right. So thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. And, and that's sometimes it's good for people at different points in their life to ask people in all different parts of their life who they respect, what they think they're good at and what they think they need work on. It's very enlightening.
So with the word advice and with the different meanings of the different letters, do you find that any one is more important than the other?
That's a really good question. People have asked me that before. Like, what if I had to only have one letter rule my life? It would be integrity. It would be I. Because I think if you tell the truth, not just to others, but to yourself, the rest of it kind of will start to fall into place. But if you're not telling the truth to others and to yourself, it's really hard to be successful. So I would say integrity.
It's funny because that would be the one that I would say too, as you're going through them. I was thinking integrity because a lot of times people don't tell the truth. A lot of times they try to get out of it. If I make a mistake on something, I'm going to fess up and say, hey, you know what? I screwed up because people screw up. People make mistakes every day. And unfortunately, in the business that I'm in, if I make a mistake, people can hear it. In other mistakes that people make in other ways of life, they can oftentimes hide it or let it go, unseen. But I always say, if you screw up, take full responsibility for your actions.
We learn more, I believe, from the things that don't work than from the things that work. And we're in such a success-driven culture. That's what our society is based on. We don't celebrate the scientists who spent 20 years discovering what didn't work. So that, and if we did, maybe we'd get farther along in other things. We celebrate the guy who finally got there, right?
Right.
So, when you make a mistake, and it's there's so many lessons in there. No one's perfect, and that's kind of what's perfect. And if you step back and say, okay, what didn't work there? And what could I do differently the next time? And do I need to apologize for anything? And if so, how do I make that a really honest, best, clean apology and move on? I think we learn more from those things sometimes than just getting it right all the time.
Dr. Helen Rothberg joining me, author of The Perfect Mix. What you just explained was another podcast that I did a while back. It's actually a local author from La Crosse, Wisconsin. His name is Ralph Heath. He wrote the book Celebrating Failure: The Power of Taking Risks, Making Mistakes, and Thinking Big. And
Fantastic.
I always use that as a stepping stone to jump off into a question of almost every one of my guests also, is a failure that you've had that turned out to be the turning point in your life. Because I think that a lot of times people have those oh crap moments that it turned on the light and all of a sudden they became who they are. What was yours?
A turning point. I grew up on the Lower East Side of New York City before it was groovy and expensive. Yeah, I couldn't even afford to live there now if I wanted to. But it was kind of a rough and tumble place in the 60s and 70s. So I had developed this attitude of, I'm going to just, strong head, and if I have to, strong on my way out of here. And the way I figured I would do that is through education. And I was always pretty good at mastering things. And I really underestimated, I would say, my first qualifying exam. I've never even spoken about this, Bob, so you're good. My first qualifying exam for my on the road to my PhD. And we had to do this big position paper, and we had to defend it in front of, the troika of power. And I had enrolled in one of those troika people's classes before, and then thought I was taking this test. Like, I didn't have the savvy to realize, that politically you take everyone's class and then you take the test. You shouldn't go in there thinking that you could stand up there and defend something if you haven't learned from everybody who's going to be your questionnaire. So I learned really hard that time. Make sure you know who you're dealing with, and talk to people who've been through this before about their experiences and learn from their experiences. That was A. And then B, I'm kind of bright. I work really hard, but I didn't really understand this whole other level of learning that was expected of somebody trying to pursue what I was trying to pursue. And I didn't take that experience seriously enough. And they made me do it again. They failed me on that. And if you fail anything twice on your way to your PhD program, you're out of there. And I already was a strange, fit for their program for a lot of other reasons. So from that, I learned, A, always work harder than you think you need to, not less hard. B, always know exactly who, what, where, and when you're dealing with. Don't ever walk into something with the naivety and the arrogance of youth. And don't be afraid to ask people for advice.
So does that kind of boil all down to your whole being a strategist now, because you learned from that at that moment and were able to parlay that into a successful career?
Absolutely. And I'd add another piece to that. And I also learned and then was able to hone this craft with this great guy, a great mentor, Ben Gilad, who I met at Rutgers, who runs this intelligence academy I talked about before, to not only do that, but to also find your information, take the competitive intelligence approach, find information from disparate sources so you could piece together as close to the truth as you possibly can and not rely too much on any one person's perspective.
How can you use some of that stuff that we're talking about and turning that into a positive business experience?
Oh, well, it's the whole approach to any time you want to go into a new market, you want to approach a new target, you want to create a new product or service, you really need to understand a few things. You need to understand what's already out there, what's already in the making, which you could discover. Patents are public information. You could look patents up. You need to understand what consumers really are looking for. Now, part of marketing says consumers don't really know what they want, right? Henry Ford said, if you ask people if they want an automobile, they'll tell you they want a faster horse. But sometimes they do know what they want. Try to identify some area that nobody else is playing, a playground no one else is playing in yet. And that's what you create, and that's a service that you deliver. Find an unmet need. So if you are doing all of this thinking and looking and research instead of just saying, this is what I'm going to make and I'm dropping it on the market, it doesn't mean you still won't do that. but maybe you'll do it a little differently because you're better informed. And you need to understand if your competitors are strong enough, have the money, the wherewithal, the reputations to fight back. You have to be prepared for that, the counterattack too.
In your years as a bartender, can you tell the jib of a person by the drink that they drink?
You know, you really can't. However, I will say that there are certain types of people, if they come in dressed a certain way. I've experienced that bow ties kind of like Manhattans, and people who dress to the nines, really expensive tie and suit, they're going to go for a single malt scotch. People who come in with their collars open and their ties ajar are probably going for a gin and tonic. So you get a little of that, but sometimes people surprise you. So I was more tuned into trying to remember the drink in the face. So if somebody had a drink that they liked a lot, I'd like to almost anticipate having it ready by the time they sat down.
That right there is a great bartender. Being a Wisconsin guy and a guy that likes to drink my beers, when that beer is ready as I walk up, that to me is a good tip. So me walking in my blue jeans and my orange Crocs and a T-shirt, you'd probably peg me as a beer guy.
Well, it's interesting you ask that. I would have thought you as a beer guy 30 years ago. However, in this day and age, that's what a lot of the tech entrepreneurs look like.
Oh, okay.
And they you see it changes, and they drink everything. So and if they're having a beer, it's probably not one that's on tap. It's some microbrew from somewhere obscure place I've never heard from.
Right.
So, yeah, it's changed. It's changed quite a bit.
What are the three things, Helen, that somebody will take from reading The Perfect Mix?
I hope they'll know that if they're working in a job they hate, they should quit and find that which will give them more joy, because life is too short. I hope they will have the courage to make the changes that might be needed either in their personal life, in their work life, in themselves. And I hope that they will know that they have the ability to really do anything they set their sights on.
Helen Rothberg, the author of The Perfect Mix. Everything I know about leadership I learned as a bartender. Helen, how do we find the book?
You could find the book in Barnes & Noble. You could find the book in independent bookstores, and you can find it on Amazon, and you can find it as an audiobook wherever you choose to find audiobooks.
Any last words of advice from the bartender?
Yeah. Lead yourself, because you can, and it's time. Cheers.
The BS with Bob Schmidt podcast is brought to you by Orange Computer. Find them online at orangecomputerlax.com. And by Tri-State Sound and Light. Find them online at tristatesound.com. Tell your story with microcasts by podcastforhire.com. The BS with Bob Schmidt podcast is a Podcast for Hire production.